I want to start with something small, something that on its own seems almost too mundane to mention. A name, not a battle, not a buried city, not a disappeared civilization, just a name, or rather the sudden coordinated government-mandated removal of thousands of them. Because here's what I kept coming back to. The deeper I went into this, before you erase a civilization from memory, you don't need to bulldoze every building. You don't need to burn every archive, though we'll get to that too. You just need to change what a place is called, and if you do it fast enough, completely enough, simultaneously enough, within a generation or two, nobody remembers what was there before. And that is exactly what happened. Not gradually, not organically, not the slow linguistic drift that gives us New York instead of New Amsterdam over the course of centuries. No, I'm talking about single days, single decrees, hundreds of cities across multiple continents stripped of their names in coordinated waves during a narrow window of history. In 1794, France, Lyon, Bordeaux and Marseille, three of the largest, most historically significant cities on the European continent, lost their names simultaneously by government order. In 1894, America, a federal directive, Order 114 from the United States Board on Geographic Names, removed hundreds of place names containing specific words. Words like old, words like new, words like ridge and valley, overnight, in a single administrative action. And Illinois, one state alone, accounts for 157 of the 323 recorded American city renames from that period. 157. The official explanation is postal efficiency, revolutionary politics, bureaucratic modernization, and maybe that's all it is, but the coordination, the timing, the pattern. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let me take you to France. The year is 1793 and a revolution is consuming everything in its path, not just kings and aristocrats, but names. Streets renamed, saints expunged, the calendar itself abolished and rebuilt from year zero. This, we're told, is the explanation. The Jacobins were erasing the old world, making France new, rational, clean, fine. I accept that framing, at least as a partial answer, but here's where the official explanation begins to strain. On the 12th of October, 1793, later enforced through 1794, the Committee of Public Safety issued decrees renaming cities that had committed what they called Federalist crimes. Lyon had resisted Paris. Toulon had invited in the British. Marseille had rebelled, so Lyon became Commune Affranchie, the liberated commune. Marseille became Ville sans nom, the city without a name. Not metaphorically, literally. A city given no name at all. Pause on that. A city of hundreds of thousands of people, one of the oldest continuously inhabited urban centres in the Western world, deliberately, officially rendered nameless. Why? The revolutionary answer is punishment, political humiliation. And yes, the politics are real, the grievances documented, I'm not dismissing them. But the deeper I looked, the stranger it got. Because the renaming didn't stop with the politically rebellious cities. It spread. It became systematic. It hit cities that hadn't rebelled, small towns, villages, places with no federalist crime to their name. They were renamed too, reformed, reclassified. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. And then I started cross-referencing dates, not the broad revolutionary period, the specific decree dates. And what emerged was not a chaotic, organic process of political punishment rolling out across months. What emerged were clusters. Single days where multiple cities in different regions with different political histories were administratively renamed simultaneously. This raises a simple but critical question. What logistical mechanism in 1793, without telegraphs, without railways, without anything resembling modern communication infrastructure, was capable of coordinating mass renaming events across an entire country, sometimes in apparent synchrony? The silence on that question in the standard histories is deafening. Now cross the Atlantic, now jump a century forward, it's 1890. America is in the middle of its great administrative consolidation. The postal system is expanding. The railroad network is complete. The frontier, famously, has just been declared closed. And in 1894, the United States Board on Geographic Names issues Order 114. I want you to really sit with what this order does. It doesn't rename cities for political reasons. It doesn't punish rebellion. It doesn't commemorate revolution. It does something almost more striking in its banality. It removes descriptive words from place names. Old is stripped. New is stripped. Ridge is stripped. Valley is stripped. Hundreds of American towns overnight are no longer called what their own founders called them. Now, the official explanation here is efficiency. Postal routes, duplication. The growing federal mail system couldn't cope with having 12 towns called New Valley in 12 different states. So standardization was necessary. That is a reasonable explanation. It would be entirely satisfying, if not for one thing. Illinois. 157 renames in one state, in one order. I've spent time with this number. I've tried to make it make sense in purely logistical terms, because even granting the postal argument fully, even saying yes, duplication was a genuine problem, why does Illinois account for nearly half of all recorded renames under Order 114? Is Illinois' postal infrastructure uniquely chaotic? Were Illinoisans uniquely attached to words like old and ridge? Did something about the Illinois landscape produce a peculiar fondness for valley in place, names that other states somehow avoided? Or is there another pattern underneath this one? A geographic pattern, a historical pattern, one that the postal efficiency framing simply doesn't explain. The deeper I went, the more Illinois started to feel less like an administrative outlier and more like a focal point, and that's where it becomes impossible to ignore. Illinois, the Illinois River Valley, the Upper Mississippi Corridor, is precisely the region where 19th century researchers, engineers and settlers kept stumbling across things they couldn't explain. Earthworks of impossible scale, canal systems of unexpected sophistication, road alignments that didn't match any known indigenous engineering tradition and didn't match any documented European colonial project either. Places with old names, names that pointed backwards towards something prior. And then, in 1894, those names were gone. I want to linger on one city in particular, because this one named itself, and in doing so, may have told us exactly what we're not supposed to know. Phoenix, Arizona. The name was chosen in 1867 by Darrell Duper, a British settler with a classical education. And the name he chose, Phoenix, was not chosen arbitrarily. Duper looked at the landscape around him, at the remnants beneath his feet, and he said explicitly, "This place should be named after the mythological bird that rises from the ashes, because this is a civilization rising from the ruins of a prior one." That's not a fringe interpretation. That's not alternative history. That's the documented first-person contemporaneous explanation given by the man who named the city. He saw ruins. He named the city after rebirth from ruins. Now, the ruins in question and the infrastructure in question were the canals. When Anglo-American settlers arrived in the Salt River Valley in the 1860s and 1870s, they found a canal system already in place. Not sketched in, not partially constructed, in place. Hundreds of miles of engineered waterways aligned to the landscape, capable of large-scale agricultural irrigation, moving water with a sophistication that modern engineers have described, without irony, as remarkable. The settlers didn't build these canals, they used them. They cleaned them out, reinforced them, and started running water through a system that someone else had engineered. Who? The academic answer is the Hohokam people, a pre-Columbian civilization that disappeared somewhat mysteriously around the 15th century. That's the name attached to the builders, the Hohokam, gone before European contact, leaving behind a canal network that a 19th century civilization would simply inherit. And here is where I want to ask a very careful, very simple question. No, not who built the canals. That question has an official answer, even if that answer raises its own mysteries. Not when the Hohokam disappeared. That question has a range of dates, a set of theories, a bibliography. No, the question I want to ask is this. How do you build hundreds of miles of precisely aligned, functionally integrated irrigation canals in a desert at a scale that a 19th century American city would use for decades, without leaving behind any of the industrial, social, or population infrastructure that should accompany a civilization capable of such engineering? And then I want to ask the quieter question underneath that one. If a prior civilization built something so sophisticated that the next civilization to arrive simply started using it, didn't need to understand it, didn't need to reverse engineer it, just turned on the water, what does that suggest about the sophistication of what came before, and why does the name of the city built on top of it explicitly reference the civilization it replaced? Phoenix, rising from the ashes. The settlers named it that themselves. Now I need to talk about something that appears on maps and then, with remarkable speed, stops appearing on maps: Tartaria. If you go back to European cartography of the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, you find something that contemporary world maps simply do not show. A vast territorial designation, sometimes called Grand Tartary, sometimes Tartaria Magna, covering an enormous swath of northern and central Asia, Russian Tartary, Chinese Tartary, independent Tartary. Sub-designations and internal regions on maps produced by the most respected cartographers of the era. It is not a fringe notation. It appears on maps from Blaeu, from Ortelius, from Mercator, from the French Royal Cartographic tradition, from British Admiralty surveys. These are not obscure sources. These are the foundational documents of Western geographic knowledge. And then, across the late 18th and early 19th centuries, roughly the same period we've been examining, the same window of revolutionary upheaval, administrative reorganization, and mass renaming, Tartaria begins to shrink on the maps, then contract, then fragment, then disappear. Now, by the mid-19th century, it's gone. The designation has been absorbed into Russia, into China, into Central Asian administrative units with new names. The official explanation is that Tartaria was never a political entity, just a geographic placeholder, a European catch-all term for territories that weren't well understood. As European knowledge improved, the term was retired in favour of more precise designations. That's a coherent explanation. But here's what that explanation struggles to account for: the speed of the disappearance and the coordination of it, because this isn't one country revising its maps. This is a pan-European, multi-imperial, multi-cartographic tradition, all converging across roughly the same decades on the same decision. Tartaria is no longer a useful category. Tartaria goes away. At the same time that cities in France are being renamed, at the same time that American place names containing words like old are being stripped, at the same time that Phoenix is being built on top of canals no one can fully explain. The evidence suggests something much larger than any single one of these events implies on its own. Because patterns at this scale, geographic, administrative, cartographic, simultaneous, cross-continental, don't emerge from coincidence. They emerge from processes. And the process, whatever it was, appears to have concluded by the end of the 19th century, with the world looking substantially different from how it looked at the beginning of the 18th. Different names, different maps, different stories about what came before. I keep returning to what I call the coordination problem. And this is, for me, the heart of it. Not the specific renames, not any individual map, not Phoenix's canals or Lyon's missing name, the coordination. In 1793, the French government renamed multiple major cities simultaneously, but the French government, in 1793, is a committee of men meeting in Paris, in the middle of a civil war. in a country without railways sending dispatches by horse. The logistical capacity to simultaneously rename cities across a country of that scale and enforce those renames in a matter of days is, at minimum, worth pausing on. In 1894, the American Board on Geographic Names issues an order that removes specific categories of words from hundreds of place names in a single action. The board was established in 1890. It had been operating for 4 years, and in one move it processed and enacted more renames than any comparable action before or since. Not a decade of gradual reform, not a rolling program of postal reclassification. One order, hundreds of names, gone, and 157 of them in Illinois. The official explanation, efficiency, modernization, standardization, doesn't collapse here. But it bends, it strains, because efficient systems don't usually produce anomalies of that scale without explanation. They produce smooth, predictable, geographically distributed outcomes. They don't produce single states accounting for nearly half the total, unless the distribution was never random. Unless Illinois specifically was where the concentration of prior naming, the naming that needed to be erased, was greatest. And here's the strangest part. When I started looking at what those 157 Illinois names were, not just the words that were removed, but the original full names, a pattern emerged that I am not prepared to characterize definitively, but I am prepared to ask about. Many of them pointed backward. Names with old in them tend to acknowledge that there was something before. Names with valley and ridge tend to be topographic, tied to the landscape itself, to the physical memory of a place. When you remove those words, you sever the linguistic connection between a location and its own history. Old Shawneetown becomes Shawneetown. The old is gone. The question of what old was referring to, what the older Shawneetown looked like, who built it, what was there before, stops being part of the name, stops being part of the daily vocabulary of everyone who lives there. A generation later, nobody asks. Why would they? It's just Shawneetown. That's how you erase something without burning it. There's one more layer to this, and I want to handle it carefully, because the renaming is one thing, the cartographic erasure is another, but there's a third anomaly that I've been circling this entire time, and I think it deserves to be named directly. Buildings. Across the mid to late 19th century, in cities across Europe, Russia and America, there is an explosion of architectural construction that historians describe as a golden age of civic building. Neoclassical government buildings, grand train stations, exhibition halls and World's Fair pavilions, ornate municipal structures in cities that, according to their own records, had been rough frontier settlements just decades before. The standard history says industrial wealth, architectural ambition, skilled immigrant labour, and all of those things are real. But here's the question that the architecture itself keeps quietly asking. Where are the intermediate stages? When you look at a city that goes from frontier settlement to possessing world-class neoclassical architecture in the span of 20 or 30 years, without commensurate documentation of construction timelines, labour forces, material sourcing, or architectural education infrastructure, the official explanation begins to require a great deal of faith. Not impossible faith, not supernatural faith, but faith nonetheless. And when you layer that architectural anomaly over the renaming pattern, cities renamed just as they're being rebuilt, just as new civic identities are being installed, just as the cartographic record is being cleaned up, a question emerges that I find I cannot stop asking. What were these buildings before they became what we call them now? I'm not claiming an answer. I want to be very clear about that. I am asking a question that the evidence, to me, makes unavoidable. If cities can be renamed in a day, cartographic traditions can be retired in a generation, and canal systems can be inherited without documentation of their builders, then what else may have been inherited? What else may have been renamed and restored and reattributed, while the prior attribution was quietly, efficiently officially retired. I started this investigation looking for something small, an anomaly, a footnote, a piece of data that didn't fit cleanly into the official timeline. What I found instead was a window that opens onto roughly 100 years of history, roughly 1750 to 1900, during which the names of the physical world were substantially reorganized, during which the maps of the physical world were substantially redrawn, during which cities in France, Russia and America lost their names in single days, during which a federal order stripped hundreds of American towns of their oldest, most backward-looking descriptors overnight, during which a vast territorial designation called Tartaria contracted and vanished from the cartographic record, during which a city in the Arizona desert was named by its own founders after rebirth from the ruins of something prior, and built on canals that nobody could fully explain. I'm not telling you what this means. I genuinely don't know what this means. But I am asking you, as someone who has spent a long time in these archives, cross-referencing these dates, staring at these maps, to consider the possibility that the official explanations we've been given are not wrong exactly. They may be accurate as far as they go. The question is whether they go far enough, because the coordination problem doesn't go away. The Illinois number doesn't go away. The cartographic timing doesn't go away. Phoenix's own founders don't go away. The canal system beneath the desert doesn't go away. And somewhere in all of that there is a question that isn't being asked loudly enough. Not whether the past was erased. The evidence suggests something much larger than a simple no can account for, not when it happened. We have the dates. They're shockingly specific. Not where. We have France and America and Russia and the maps of Central Asia. The geography is world-spanning. No. The question, the one that keeps me up, the one that brought you here, is why. Why does the coordination exist? Why does the timing cluster? Why does Illinois account for 157 of 323? Why does a desert city name itself after a phoenix rising from ruins built on canals it didn't dig, reaching for a civilization it may not fully understand itself to be inheriting? Why do places stop being called what they were, all at once, on the same days, in different countries? As if something large, something prior, something that had names and maps and canals and architecture, was being administratively concluded, filed away, renamed, and buried just shallow enough that, a century later, someone sitting in an archive with old maps and a list of city decrees might look up from the papers and think, wait, this isn't random, this isn't coincidence, this is a pattern, and once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it.